This is a Music Therapy Chronicles podcast episode with Jennifer Jones.
That's a value, right? That's a clinical judgment. That's more intuition, which is why I say there's really no fine line between quantitative and qualitative. We're all looking at it as a story. One just has a little more math in it, one has a little less. But there's no way to take out valuing and giving numbers context.
You're listening to the Music Therapy Chronicles, a podcast about music therapy from a variety of perspectives. Our ambition is to inspire and connect listeners through meaningful conversations, just like a music therapy conference you can listen to anywhere. My name is Trisha Coyote. I'm your weekly host and a board-certified music therapist from the New England region. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe so you never miss an episode and consider leaving us a rating and review. We really appreciate them. You can find more podcast episodes, links to our pod courses, the self-care community, links to all of our social media, and get on our monthly newsletter, all at musictherapychronicles.com. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this show today, and you can always reach me by sending an email to hello@musictherapychronicles.com. Welcome back to the Music Therapy Chronicles. Thank you so much for being here today for my episode with Jennifer. This was a really thought-provoking episode. This whole conversation started because Jennifer reached out to me about a different episode of the podcast. So she is a listener of the podcast, reached out to me to share her thoughts, which I so appreciate. And I said, this is awesome, very thought-provoking, very informative. Like, I would love to have this conversation. And will you come on the show so that everyone can be part of it? So really appreciative to her for coming on. If you ever just want to reach out and tell me your thoughts and you don't want to come on the show, that's okay. I will say that. I do want to hear what you have to say. But it is really cool to be able to open up the conversation and see how these episodes inform each other, lead into each other, start more deeper conversations. Like, I love that about this podcast and the community that we have created and that we have. So thank you for being here, for listening to the episodes, for sharing your thoughts or sharing this episode with another person. That's how this podcast has grown. Just word of mouth, people saying like, hey, I listened to this, you might like it, whether it is a friend, a colleague, a music therapist, a related professional, an intern, a student, a teacher, whatever it is, word of mouth is how people have found this show. So thank you so much for supporting the Music Therapy Chronicles. I've been at this for 3.5 years, going on 4 years. So it's great to have built such a community over time. I'll get up my soapbox now, but I am really appreciative. So today with Jennifer, we're talking about polarity and music therapy. And we look at, don't let this word scare you, we look at research. We're talking about research and the polarity in research mostly. So qualitative versus quantitative versus mixed method and all this kind of stuff. And we touch on some other polarity in music therapy. Yeah, and I'll just let you listen to the episode and share my other thought at the end of this episode. So for now, let's get into my conversation with Jennifer. All right, Jennifer, welcome to the Music Therapy Chronicles.
Thank you.
How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Good. So, to start us off, can you tell the listeners about yourself? And it can be related to music therapy or not.
Sure. I am closing in on my 30th year as an MTBC. So, this is a long story, I guess, of how did I get here. I was a very die-hard band kid, flute player.
Hmm.
Started in the sixth grade, really had no early exposure to music, a very unmusical family, but I really wanted to be in the band. And unfortunately, I had signed up for clarinet, but got braces over the summer and had to switch. So I didn't get my instrument for 3 weeks. So I made a paper flute and I would practice my paper flute waiting on my instrument to get there. And I was in love within a week of music in
Wow.
sixth grade. So all the way through high school, did all the things with music, started looking at a career, and I wanted psychology. In fact, I wanted to be a psych tester. I wanted to be the person who gives psychological examinations to people. So, very
Mm.
much that mind thinking, quantification elements to my brain. And I wanted scholarship money in music
Yeah.
because you got to pay for school. So I went over, did my flute audition, and they said, well, guess what? We don't give scholarships unless you're a music major. But we see music and psychology. This was 1988. Do you know what music therapy is? And I was like, no. And they said, well, why don't you go upstairs and talk to the music therapy faculty and see if that's something that interests you? Well, 30 minutes later, I came down, pronounced myself a music therapy major, got my scholarship, and went forward from there. I remember my electrical engineering dad saying, what are you studying? And I said, I have no idea. But in
Oh,
four
perfect.
years, I'm sure I will know. And so, very much just taking it on faith that music, staying in music felt good and felt important, and leaving it behind felt impossible. So, we
Mm.
married music and therapy together and did I think at that point my training was very person centered and kind of mental health heavy. So that's how I saw myself. Did an internship in central Pennsylvania at an inpatient children through adolescent through adult psychiatric hospital. Finished my internship, and I was in that cycle of people that could only take the exam once a year.
Oh.
I'm that I'm that person. So I took the exam a month before my wedding and got my results on my wedding day. At which point I said, I don't care what's in that envelope. Like, this is not the focus today. My mom opened my certification exam for me. She said, you passed. And I was like, great. I need to get my nails dried. Right?
Yeah.
Like, didn't even hit me until about 2 days later. I was like, oh, I'm an MTBC. That's kind of cool.
And a wife.
And now I'm a wife, and I changed my last name from Smith to Jones, which is why I didn't hyphenate and why I didn't keep my parents' name, because Smith Jones in the same household is just a little comedic. So I kept Jones all the way through. So internship, went into clinical practice. I saw mental health as my niche. That's where I wanted to be. Got a job, several jobs, 3 years working in inpatient mental health, and I chose to go back to school for my master's degree in music therapy. So I went to Florida State at that point, switched more to a behavioral lens. So I came from person-centered humanistic, switched more towards behavioral. And when I went in, I said, the thing you have to let me not do is go back into mental health. I need to learn about other types of work and other ways of thinking about this. Now, I worked during school as a mental health music therapist because you got to pay for school. But I really got to see early childhood, got to see developmental disability, got to see medical practice a little. And I was like, okay, so this is broadening, which is why I went to grad school, broaden my focus. So when I returned to full-time clinical practice after school, I went into developmental disability. So I worked in
Mm.
early childhood, 0 to 3, for a while, and then I worked at an institution in ICFMR is what they called it, which we've stopped calling it that, intermediate care facility for individuals with developmental disabilities, and mostly adults. We had a handful of people under 20, but most of the people were adults, and they had lived the majority of their lives there. So that was coming up into the 2000s. Thankfully, that place is closed, and all of those folks now live in a community, in a home, and have services come to them. So I've seen that shift in my career
Yeah.
lifetime. So I did that for several years, and then a job came up in college teaching at my alma mater, which was Tennessee Tech. And I was like, let's just see if this is something I want to do. And it was. And again, like the experience with 1 week after having my flute in my hands after a week of teaching, I'm like, this is the thing. This is the thing that matches all of the skills that I've been growing. So I started college teaching at that point and have never looked back, I guess. So I've been in higher ed teaching or my PhD for, coming on 20 years now.
Wow. Good for you.
Yeah. A lifer.
Yeah.
I'm a lifer for music therapy.
Yeah. I have kind of a very finite question. Where did you do your internship? Like what was
Yes,
the location?
it was Center Hall, Pennsylvania, outside of State College at a psychiatric facility called the Meadows.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I know the Meadows. I did my internship at the Danville State Hospital. So I didn't know if maybe we had been at the same place, but I am familiar with the
Yeah.
Meadows. I actually had a friend who worked there for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I was just curious. I was like, what are the odds that we were in the same place?
It was
We're
my
just down the
one,
street.
yeah, it was my one time living in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I've lived in the Southeast region, the Mid-Atlantic region, and now the Great Lakes region. So I'm doing my tour, I guess, of parts of the country across my
Yeah.
career.
Yeah. But also, like you said, you've been in this long enough to have seen like a huge trajectory and lots of changes and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really cool to hear about.
Yeah,
So
length of
yeah.
stay, like just length of stay in my mental health phase, which was about 8 years from internship through that switch into developmental disability. My internship, I mean, people stayed more than a week inpatient. And when I first started in clinical practice in Nashville, we only wrote progress notes once a week because patients stayed long enough that about a week was a nice summary. By the time I moved to Florida to do my graduate work, it was a daily note because the length of stay was getting shorter and shorter, and patients were being discharged without any record of services. And so I was like,
Yeah.
well, that's not good because I have information that's important for the medical team to see and to benefit from. And I think one of the most compliments I ever got was the psychiatrist we worked with. She said, I read your note first. When I get to the unit, I read what they did in music therapy first, because then I kind of know how my patient is actually doing before I even go see them. And I was like, wow, that's great. Like I will be very astute and give you good quality notes because I appreciate that you're considering how they're expressing themselves and how they're engaging in ways other than just a quick report of their symptoms to you, because that's not a real good picture of their recovery. So I was delighted that somebody actually read my progress notes.
Yeah. Well, also just to know that you have that support network, because, so many of us, I'm sure, are doing notes and like, no one's going to read this and blah, blah, blah. But like, hey, there could be that one person who really prioritizes what you have to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. So the meat of our conversation today was a little bit of a hard shift. You want to talk about research, and I love when you reached out to me and you were like, "Hey, I have these thoughts about something you said on your show," because I love when someone's like, "You said this thing or you talked about this thing," and like, here's a different perspective on it. So I'm just gonna let you take it wherever you're ready to take it, whatever's on top of mind.
Sure. So I am a fangirl. I listen to your podcast quite frequently.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so I appreciate the breadth of the guests, and especially as somebody who's been in college teaching as long as I have, I love to hear from clinicians talking about the work because that keeps me grounded in what I'm teaching to students as they move into the profession as it is now, not the profession it was 10 years or 20 years ago when I was still an active clinician. And the podcaster was talking about quantitative and qualitative inquiry and kind of the idea of numbers and measures and associated it really as a pole, right? Numbers are on one side, qualitative descriptors are on another side, and that they are, in my mind, I was like poles. I just don't like the idea of poles anymore, almost in anything in my life. It's just too muddy in real life, and it's too intersecting to separate it as a pole. The other thing
Mhm.
the podcaster mentioned was that quantities were more masculine and that qualities were more feminine. And like little flashing lights went off on my head. I'm like, ooh, I really don't like that. I
Yeah.
really don't like that. And what I didn't like probably has to do with my background as a student in high school. I was the only female on the math team for 4 straight years. And in fact, when you put the whole like freshman through senior teams together, I think there were only 2 women, and all the rest of the teams were guys. And it was really seen as not female to be good at math. In
Yeah.
fact, verbatim, my math teacher said, if not once a day, once a week, everybody knows boys are smarter than girls.
Ah, snickerdoodles.
And I'm like, well, I will just take that as fuel to prove
Yeah.
you wrong that
Yeah.
I am, in fact, as math smart as these guys surrounding me. And hopefully, long term, we can make one another smarter at this. So I really pulled back as a female in a profession dominated by females who are often trying to, I use the word prove ourselves in a scientific world like medicine.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that we gravitate towards numerical data, towards quantity, because that is a language of science. And I don't want it to be associated as female or male because there's such a polling with that. And
Yeah.
likewise, I don't want non females to feel like quality or story is somehow unmasculine. Like,
Mm.
I'd just like to take the gender thing out entirely. Let's just have information. Some information is quantity, some information is quality and story, and they inform in a different way. And
Yeah.
that is what I think we're getting there with mixed methods. And
Yeah. Yeah.
we're getting there. But it's if you are a math brain or you're a story brain, it's still hard to embrace the other side of that and see it from their perspective. I call it throwing sand. Like we have the quantitative sandbox and the qualitative sandbox. And if you're playing in your own sandbox, everybody is happy. But at some point, somebody throws sand at you and
Yeah.
challenges your way of thinking. And instead of saying, hey, I enjoyed getting sand in my face, we just throw sand back. And it's like, no, there's value in both. Even the term value is loaded. Like value can mean a
Mm.
number, but it can also mean really a heartfelt belief at the
Yeah.
same time. So as I was making notes to myself, I just kept looking at this idea of poles and quantity and really how do we document in music therapy, whether it's clinical practice or in research, how are we valuing different things and whether that's and when it's numbers and then when it's not.
Yeah, totally. And we kind of briefly touched on there's a ton of polarity in our profession. And that's one of the things I love about the podcast again, because I get to talk with people and they get to tell me like this is where I stand or this is, I'm in the middle or whatever. It's nice to hear the different perspectives. And so oftentimes if I like had a nickel for every time on the show, I'd said the word polarity, duality, paradox, like anytime I've been like in the middle of saying something and then literally thought and said out loud, well, but actually this is the other side. And like they both, yeah. And I don't think that's just us as clinicians. I think that is like helping professionals, therapists, like all across the gambit. And like you're saying, research is kind of a very tangible way to see how this polarity exists and all the different colors of that.
Yeah, and I want each of us to kind of embrace that there's multiple ways to think about things.
Mm.
And there may be a type or practice or group of people. I'm trying not to say population, that doesn't mean anything
Yeah.
anymore. Group of people that you want to support, that just feels more natural to you. And that's okay. Gravitate
Mm.
towards your strengths, but keep in your mind that someone else's strengths may be in something that looks very opposite to that. And that doesn't make their creativity wrong if you're a math person. And if you are
Hmm.
a creative, it doesn't make math people limited. It's just a way to value what we're doing in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's making me think of the current conversation is not the word, but the awareness around the neurodivergent community
Yeah.
and a lot of neurodivergent people, being public about their experience and advocating and trying to be a voice for, that they didn't have when they were younger and that type of thing. And from people in my own life, one of the things they say is, growing up, I was always told that I think wrong or the way I process things is wrong. Um, so this is making me think of that. It's like it doesn't have to be as extreme as like neurotypical versus
Yeah.
neurodivergent, but just people think differently, and it's important to understand each as much as we can because together we can gain and apply so much more information.
Yeah. And just not putting things, I think, on those poles,
Yeah,
on either or this or that continuum. And I got to thinking about this the other day. It's like, well, what do I not like about poles? Because it seems like opposites is part of it. But we
mm.
use that in research with semantic differentials. Those are the scales that have zero in the middle, -1, -2, 3 on one side, and +2, +2, 3 on the others. And usually what's on those words, which is the irony of scaling, is that you have to describe it with words, is you put happy on one side, sad on the other, or highly dislike or highly like, and you pull those as poles, which in some
Mm.
research that's good. Like that's helpful information to say I have zero anxiety, I have a very high level of anxiety, or I have a very low level of anxiety, and I can pull either way. But what's the opposite of happy? Is it sad? Is it discontent? Is it
Mm.
unhappy? And so we have to come up with a word that could be argued by a number of people really isn't the opposite of the other word.
Yeah,
And so, from a math standpoint, what do those numbers, what do those scores mean if the person responding doesn't agree with how you've labeled those polls?
totally.
So, you get inaccurate or non representative data from that person who's trying their best to mark the bubble or fill in the dot or click the box. But to them, they feel both happy and sad because those don't feel like two things that can't exist at the same time.
Mm. Yeah. I have a very clinical application I want to get your thought on. So
Sure.
I'm working with one of my people, young man, autism, and we're working. He one day he was like, I want to write a song. Cool. What are we going to write about? He says, my feelings. It's like, this is something we've been like very slowly working towards. Like, yes, we're going to write about your feelings. Um, and he equates or at least verbalizes every emotion with happy or good. So we'll do stressed or frustrated or angry or sad. And I'll say, how does that feel in your body? Or what is that similar to? And everything is happy and good. So yes, like working with him to say they can exist together, but
Mm-hmm.
how do we say they are different?
Mm-hmm.
Even though they can coexist, these are different things. They are opposite feelings in a
Mm-hmm.
way. Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
have any thoughts on that?
sure. Well, if I don't know him, so I don't know how. But I think,
Just in general.
yeah, I've worked with folks who struggle with what does my body feel like during
Yeah.
emotions.
Right?
And that's the body is one measure. What
Mm.
I think about is a different measure. So he's reporting to you how he thinks about it, is mostly good. And you're trying to ask him to measure it as if it's physical sensations for him.
Mm.
And he's not there. He's not describing his feelings in those ways yet.
Mm.
I had a young man we worked with, not on the spectrum per se, but had some intellectual disability and could label the emotions. He could tell me what situation might happen if you feel that emotion. And you would ask him, what does it feel like in your body? And he couldn't answer us. He'd just get stuck. I was like,
Mm.
that's a totally different experience of emotion, to understand
Mm-hmm.
that your physiology, your neurology, your body is also communicating that. So
Mm-hmm.
I often think of that when we have research studies that have like 5 or 6 dependent variables. We got heart
Yes.
rate, we got blood pressure, we've got a self-report of anxiety, a self-report of relaxation. And we'll often, especially in relaxation literature, find that the biology and the self-report don't correlate.
Yeah.
And I was like, who's right? Which part of that data is is meaningful? They could
Yeah.
both be accurate, but which one is meaningful? Is the patient saying, I feel calmer, I experience myself as calmer, I'm ready to go into the surgery lab, but in fact, my blood pressure is still high and didn't go down, and my heart rate is high and didn't go down? Is that, no, in fact, you're not calm?
Mm.
So those are 2 different ways of looking at the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
And you're asking your client to measure it in one phenomenon, and he's not measuring it in that way. He's measuring it in the way he describes it.
Yeah. 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 You're making me think of Vanderkolk, the body keeps the score, that type of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where like, we intellectualize or maybe in a way disassociate from the body. And so, in our head, we're saying, yeah, I feel this way. But the body is saying, you actually may feel a different way.
Yes. I don't know that my body is capable of lying, but I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure my brain and my mouth are capable of lying.
Well said.
So chances are there's some reality to those high blood pressure, high heart rate. I'm about to go into surgery. I think I feel okay, but probably there's some truth on both sides. And the
Mm.
anesthesiologist is probably a little more concerned with my biology variables than my mental state, which
Yeah,
probably will show up more on patient satisfaction surveys.
true.
So it's like they're going to have to make their decision based on the biology.
Yeah. So you are also teaching a course this semester that has to do with like this research
Yeah.
and looking at stuff, and you're trying to add this lens to it. So what has that brought up for your classes so far? Or have you had like
Sure.
any really intricate discussions on this?
Yes, this is my undergraduate research methods in music therapy, which I enjoy teaching, knowing that in the end, the percentage of the students who are going to turn into career researchers is fairly small. But I
Mm.
want them, first of all, to learn to question everything
Yeah.
and to know enough about quantity and quantitativeness in research that they can make a deduction from what they read that's informed. And over time, I think the biggest shift in the curriculum has been there's always been kind of a quantitative unit, a descriptive qualitative unit, and now I've got to find spot for mixed methods because
Yeah.
that is really where the research is headed, is being able to look at both sides, being able to look at a sound, well-tested, variable report from the person experiencing music therapy, and then see to what degree they those 2 ways of measuring, those 2 ways of valuing, align or disalign.
Mm.
So I listened to lots of podcasts, and there was one they were talking about. Oh, it was one on cognition. I'm going to get the data wrong, and I don't have the author, but it was like retirement reduces your cognitive capacity. Okay, I would like to know a little more about that study before I
Right.
decide to never retire because I'm going to lose cognitive capacity. But we just got the tagline, and that wasn't really the point of the podcast. So I said, this is a good question for the students. I said,
Mm.
here's the tweetable social media length outcome of a researcher study. You know, researchers find that people's cognitive capacity deteriorates after retirement. I said, what else do you want to know before
Mm.
you tell me to never retire? Like, how old were the participants? Good. What else? How old were they when they retired? Yes. How long was it from the first time they tested to the last time they tested? Yes. What else? Well, what did they do as a career? Yes. What have they done since retirement? Now you're thinking. Now you're thinking of what do I really want to know before I walk away? Not that that statement wasn't truthful. Their data could have easily represented a cognitive decline. I
Mm.
want to know, did you vet it with age? Did you vet it? What was your scale? What was the tool? Where, and they were like, well, where were the participants even tested? Like if they retired at 70 and now they're 85, like did they had to come to a lab? And were they nervous when they came to the lab? I'm like, yay,
Yeah.
you're learning, right? Take what you get. There, it's not that the researchers were trying to skew the outcome, but there's a lot of things that would go into that conclusion that before you decide never to retire, yeah, you want to know that. And so that's really my aim for them to look at research and look at numbers and not be too afraid in the results section when you see columns and columns and columns of numbers. Try to see what it means. Like what is the
Mm.
what does that number 23 mean? You have to look back and see, well, what was the tool? Right? It's like, well, okay, that was the Beck Depression Inventory. Is a 23 a score that means you have a high level of depression, or is it a score that means you have a low level of depression? And when they do their music therapy treatment and you test again, what does a change in that score mean? Did the person get better or not? Did they get
Mm.
a little bit better, or did they get a whole lot better? And I said, and that's numbers. And if you aren't somebody who likes to read math, you kind of get panicky in that section. It's like, just, drink your coffee, calm down, just read it, just look at it, see if you can figure out, is there a clinical benefit?
Mm.
Because when you get to the statistics, numbers are just numbers to statistics programs. It's not a person, it's not a score, it's not clinically relevant or irrelevant, it's just a number. The
Yeah.
researchers have to decide, is those change in scores meaningful?
Mhm.
Did the people in this study benefit? A little, not so much, not at all. That's a value, right? That's a clinical
Yeah.
judgment. That's more intuition, which is
Yeah.
why I say there's really no fine line between quantitative and qualitative. We're all looking at it as a story. One just has a little more math in it, one has a little less. But there's no way to take out valuing and giving numbers context. So maybe a
Yeah.
2 point drop in something is fantastic. That's like, wow, nobody ever has a 2 point change. This is an amazing technique of music therapy. Or maybe 2 points is like, it's really nothing. Like, if it's blood pressure, 120, 122, ugh, maybe not that clinically impactful. It doesn't make the number wrong. It just means it
Mm.
doesn't really it doesn't show us very much.
Yeah. Yeah, and that has implications for taking our session notes and taking progress notes. Yeah, like this is very applicable not just to research, but to
Yes.
just what we're doing day to day.
Well, I had an epiphany while running this morning. Um,
Yeah,
I'm a 5K runner. I am
good
chasing
for you.
really hard to get my 5K under 36 minutes. This morning I did it by 1 second.
Good for you.
So
Yes.
good run. So qualify that. That
Ready for all
was
those Halloween turkey
yes.
trots. All stuff.
Homecoming is coming up around here.
Yeah.
We have a military connection with our university, so our Fallen Soldiers run is coming up. So almost got my time. So if you ask me, was that a good run? I'll say, yeah, that was a good run. And then you ask me, well, what were the metrics? Well,
Mm.
my first mile was 11:42, which was good. It was good pacing. My heart rate was good. So that was probably a pretty good mile. Mile 2 was fast. I sped up. So it was 11:20. But my heart rate got too high. I have an alarm. So my heart rate alarm's going off. So I'm like, okay, mile 3. I'm trying to balance, not overexerting, so that my heart rate yells at me all day and I have a headache, because that's what happens.
Mm.
And still aiming for this sub 36. So mile 3 was like, I don't know, depends on what metric you looked at. It was 11:52. And then I had the 10th of a mile where I'm like, I'm just running because I'm like this close to making my 36. I made it by 1 second. But it's like, what part of your clinical judgment? So thinking of mile 1 is one session, mile 2 is another session, mile 3 is another session. When you're taking documentation, what made that a good session? Was it the
Mm.
time, or was it me controlling my heart rate? So that, I mean, that's all over the place in terms of things. So thinking of, I supervise several students working in special education classrooms, and you're out with the student, and it's a fairly large elementary classroom, varied diagnoses, and we have to balance things that are more social and engaging and creative and things they find enjoyable, and academic learning, song based, repetition, come up, spell this word, sing a song about it type things, because those take more attention.
Yeah.
And some days you walk into the classroom and you're just like, oh boy, we don't have the attention capacity that we had last week for
Yeah.
whatever reason. And you can decide, well, that was a bad session, or you can decide that it was actually a good session if I measure it based on helping the children self-regulate and stay on task and stay engaged for 45 minutes. When I walked in and assessed, we're not in that space. Or it was, quote, a bad session because we didn't have every child come up to the board and spell a word or do a math thing. But it's
Mm.
like, but I made that clinical judgment. So on my data sheet, sure, there are children who, quote, didn't meet their goal that day because it says 2 things of academics or whatever, or they didn't get them right because they were distracted that day. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can qualify that, well, that was a bad session. Well, are you looking at time or heart rate?
Yeah. That you took the words out of my mouth from working in classrooms for years and
Yeah.
years. And some days you walk in and I'm like, today is a self-regulation day. If I can leave this classroom and they're a bit calmer and the teacher can then do the academics, then that is a success for today.
Yeah, yeah. Or if you only isolate that one session, whatever report you have isn't going to give you that big picture.
Yeah.
So in field work and students, I said we have a finite amount of time. We are working in a semester. At the end of the semester, you do your clinical summary, and then the next semester you get different clients just to have varied experience. And me as a clinician, I'm like, 8 treatment sessions is nothing. That is
Yeah.
no time at all to have a
Mm-hmm.
human being have a substantial, measurable change in who they are. I said, you just need these little bitty micro goals that you can keep your mind on so that you're not just throwing music things at them, but you have purpose and you have intention. But don't be devastated when at the end of the semester they don't, quote unquote, meet their goal.
Yeah.
It's like, that's just 8 sessions. It's just not
Nothing.
enough time
No,
for most
not at
folks
all.
to have a measurable
Mm-hmm.
change, especially some of the folks we see. It's just not enough time.
Mm-hmm. That's an important lesson that what am I trying to say? So when I was an undergrad, we had like an off-site practicum that we did for a semester. And then we had an on-site clinic that they transitioned while I was there to be a full year
Oh.
with the same
Mm-hmm.
person. And so that was my time to observe, like, oh, right, doing a full year of this, I do see more than like the 8 times I saw,
Yeah.
whoever I was seeing offsite. And then now, having worked with certain people I've been working with for years and years and years, I'm like, oh my gosh, like you can barely build rapport in 8 weeks sometimes. And like, that's okay when you have the time to do that. So
Yeah.
for sure.
And I've worked in several different settings that were single session. So inpatient medical, inpatient psych, where the length of stay got really short and maybe I only had music therapy on Monday and Tuesdays and not Wednesdays, and then Thursdays and Fridays. And so my Monday people could be gone by Thursday. And so you
Yeah.
did have a very short period of time and you learned to go in with a target. Like, I want to have them experience this thing in session. I want to be able to document on that outcome. But it wasn't as easy to number it in some way. It's like, I would like every person to have a chance for self expression related to feelings.
Yeah.
Does it matter if they self expressed 2 feelings or 4 feelings or just feelings? Right?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't math real easily. And that's okay. I mean, if they gave me a purposeful, meaningful statement about their experience related to the music things I brought for them, fantastic. But education and developmental disability, it was a numbers world. Like, you had accuracy and percentage and prompt levels and like all of these pieces of data floating around in your head while you've got 10 students that you're trying not to throw things or fall asleep. And you're like, I think my head's going to
Yep.
explode. But that was the demands of the setting, right? So it varied across my career still of how numbery do we need to be, and numbers make sense to people. Like, if you have a pie chart or a bar graph in a person's summary for the year, people look at that and go, oh, look, music therapy helped.
Yeah.
And you're like, we need that. We need that. Yes, it did. Or if it didn't, we really need to contemplate, is this an appropriate service?
Yeah.
And if it's not,
Yeah.
that's okay too.
100%. I think that's like a whole other thing to,
Another thing.
yeah. Yeah. Which we can get into if you want. But yeah, is music therapy, I don't even want to say necessary. Is music therapy actually benefiting
Beneficial.
the person?
Beneficial
Yeah.
is a good word.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Are there other polarities that you wanted to touch on? Because, there's a lot. But is there like one that's really screaming at you today?
Not particularly the polarities, but I think the intersection of describing and giving numbers. I actually have 2 articles I would recommend to listeners to go and pull. They're very different and I can send them to you. One is by John Carpenti. It was in Music Therapy Perspectives, I think 2018, and it's goal attainment scaling. And then it's a way to create basically kind of a rubric looking at the client's participation in some way. His article is centered around music centered. So being able to describe in a leveled system how the person is in music, what musical output they put in improvisation, what would represent health or improvement. So there's 2 scales that help them be better. And then there's 2 points on that scale where they are below wherever their baseline was. And the beauty of that scale is that you can cover any expression. That those could be things about attention, those could be things about emotional expression. Whatever that scale you create is your description. Like, it's your description as a clinician. Where is their baseline, which I think is 0. And then there's a minus 2 categories and minus and 2 categories for benefit. And there's a math on it. So if you want to do the math and show, did you have a meaningful change at 2 points across treatment, you can have that. So it's the beauty. I think it's that intersection again of, can you really describe what the person is doing in music and what would be better and what it would look like if they're losing skills over time. because I don't think you can ever get away from that marriage of numbers and description.
Hmm.
And one of the mixed method studies that I find really helpful for people to ponder this, and I'm going to get all the authors. It is in JMT in 2016. It's called Vocal Music Therapy for Chronic Pain Management in Inner City African Americans, a Mixed Methods Feasibility Study by authors Yoka Brott, Marisol Norris, Minjun Shim, Edward Gracely, and Patricia Garrity. And there's a beautiful table that intersects the qualitative and the quantitative data and shows where one revealed the person's served experience differently. And because they interviewed the people, they were able to understand when they experienced skepticism about those standardized tools and what it would mean if they marked certain things. And so some of the reports on the benefit of the study, it was vocal music, was different than the quantitative variables, that they didn't align on paper, but it was because of how they looked at those tools. So even though as researchers we very much value reliable, valid, tested, standardized measures because we believe that there's less error built into the tool itself, it's still up to a person to read it and say, am I a 1 today or a 6? And if I mark a 6, what does that mean about me?
Yeah.
Does that mean I'm well or unwell based on my score? And then a report in an interview may reveal those benefits, right? It's like, yes, I feel relaxed and less stressed, but my blood pressure is still high, right? It's like, yeah, both of those things can coexist. They just inform differently.
Interesting. I am thinking the first study you mentioned with Carpente,
Uh-huh.
the baseline
I
0
think it's
being
0.
able to move, even though 0 is always 0, that being able to move and like needing that description of where 0 is in one day, like that's super applicable, I think, just to like our daily notes.
Yeah.
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 And go ahead.
Yeah, I have the article up. 0 is the expected outcome.
Okay.
0 is expected outcome. +1 is greater than expected. +2 is most favorable. And then 0 expected, -1 is less than expected, and -2 is least favorable. And I'd have to refresh myself on the article on whether the intention is like per session scales or like over time, like a start, end of 16 weeks type of scale. But yeah, even using 0 as an expected outcome makes us feel weird because 0 has a connotation.
Neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. I'll have to dive into those. But like you said, if you send them and I'll find
Sure.
them either way, and we'll put them in the show notes so that people can check those out for themselves too.
Yeah, it's what do the numbers mean? And numbers have
Yeah.
meaning to us. We've looked at this a couple of times with how do you grade practicum? How do you grade
Yeah.
internship? And we've just gone through the Higher Learning Commission re-certification with our university. So we've been doing all this stuff on assessment. And the School of Music often gets dinged for our assessment practices because everybody is superlative. Like everybody is a 4 out of 4. Everybody's doing everything awesome. And we're like, yeah, but we like teach to that, right? We teach to excellence. It's like, but from an assessment standpoint, that's like, you can't do that. So we have to use a does not meet, meets minimally. I can't remember the next one. Meets expectations and then exceeds expectations.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. So across whatever I'm evaluating, I kind of need people to be minimally meets
Yeah.
to reflect across the group. Like everybody can't be excellent. I said, and this is not data we give to the students as informative of their process. I said, but if we did, and I see this with internship scales sometimes, that really perfectly good enough is 3, but there is a 4.
Mm.
And at midterm, most people get 2s. And when I first see that, I'm like, oh dear, what are they doing wrong? Please,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
what if I, how can I support them? Do I need to like meet with them? We're like, no, everybody gets a 2. 2 means it's good. Oh, good. Fine.
Yeah.
Great. Well, then congratulations on your success and midterm, right? Because that number doesn't mean the same to me as it meant to the person who was giving that score.
Yeah.
And so threes are a perfectly MTBCable person, and I don't know who 4 is. I guess they're just a superhero.
Yeah. I some of the schools I go to, I'm like music education adjacent. And so I have to do like report cards, and they use a similar scale, outstanding, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, needs improvement,
Yeah.
anyway, some variation of that. And again, it's set on expectations. And like, yes, the school has their list of expectations. I have, rules and expectations in my classroom, but like I might have higher expectations of certain students, or my expectations might be too high. And I think like in general in my class, the students aren't meeting them, but the rest of the staff is saying, hey, they did really well in your class. This is the first time they've attended to anything all day. So yeah, there's so much bias in that too. It's like we're trying to make this scalable in a way that's universal. But you got humans on both end of that, either putting in the data or tracking the data. And so it's not universal and scalable.
No. And at some point, we have to describe to one another, what does a
Yes.
3 mean to you? What does a 3 mean to me? And if we are looking at the same phenomenon in session, if we've described it well enough, we should be able to come to the same conclusion that what we saw is a 3 or it's not a 3.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because we're trying to describe elements of music, right? Were they attending if they weren't making eye contact? Well, could be, but
Yeah.
it's difficult to observe and quantify. What I can quantify is what I can see. What I can see is they're looking at their shoes. But a week later, I asked them something from session last week when I thought they quote unquote were not attending, and they repeated verbatim what we did. So in fact, they were
Yes.
attending, and my need to quantify that by percentage of eye contact is just not a good measure. So I got to come up with some other way to measure it. And so I think we're constantly refining, hopefully, how we measure.
Yeah.
And then how is that meaningful to capture the client's experience, especially when it comes to, is the service beneficial or not for that person?
Yeah. And you won't know unless they have that moment where they speak up and show you that they got something out of, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple of students in mind where like other staff, they'll come to my room and the other staff will be like, oh, we're just going to take so-and-so out of session because clearly they're not participating or whatever. I'm like, no. So-and-so is a sponge. They must sit there and absorb at their own pace, but I know they're absorbing everything.
Yes. Yes. And it's delayed. We often
Yeah.
want their response immediately after service delivery. And often we
Yeah.
get it 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years
Yeah.
later. And depending on when your contact with that person ended, you may not see that. And I think it's an
Totally.
Orson Welles quote we used one year when we were talking about closure. I said, whether or not a story has a happy ending kind of depends on where you stop the story.
Ah.
And I was like, that really resonated for students in field work who have such a limited time with their clients. It said, you may not see the benefit of your service, but the person who sees that same person next semester could. I said, or it could
Yeah.
be 2 years from now. And because I've supervised here in this community for more than a decade, I'm like, I see it 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Or on the other end, I remember how our older adults were 10 years ago and how they're different now, but I have their history. So I'm like, I know what music they enjoy. I know their stories of their life, and when they're not able to retrieve them quickly, I know those familiar experiences that can bring them back. I said, you're seeing them at this stage in their dementia. but it's not how they've always been. They've been
Mm.
different, and it's just a matter of being able to kind of see those over time. And I think time is one of those factors that we measure it in days and hours, but on some higher level, that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It happens when it happens.
Yeah. Well said. Is there anything else you want to dive into before we do the rapid fire?
Oh no, I have all kinds of things in here about how do you value what you measure. The last one is journal articles, just because I have to put a plug in here. For those of
Yeah.
you who aren't on the interior part of journals, there's two factors that we use to see if an article was, for a lack of a better term, successful or not. One is impact factor, and journals have this number that says how impactful they are, and it has to do with how frequently an article was cited in the year following its publication.
Hmm.
So that has a lot to do with a lot of different things, like the appeal, the scope, the type of the article, traffic in that particular area of scholarship, and then you get an impact factor. And it's important because people use impact factors for things. Another is a score called altmetrics, and it has to do with social media and how much traction a particular article gets on social media. So those are two different ways of looking at quote unquote success of any published article, but they come from two very different sources.
Yeah.
And so it just is a matter of, what do you value? Like, which of those metrics have meaning to you as a scholar, and how much stake you put in the meaningfulness of those numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad you had a social media one in there, because that's transferable to just daily life.
It is. It is, but it also means that somebody somewhere has to put a research article out into social media
Yeah.
and get action with it, get interaction with it.
Yeah.
And that's not always how we've approached sharing scholarship in the past.
Totally. What an interesting world we live in.
It's weird.
It's weird.
It's just a weird time to be alive, I think.
But also exciting, because conversations like this are happening. And
They
like
are.
we said at the beginning of this, you've seen a lot of changes
Yeah.
over time. And I'd like to think most of them have been positive changes in a beneficial direction that is helping more humans than it is hurting.
I hope so. I hope that we are able better to step back and see value and how you're measuring value, that those can be different systems. And you don't measure an apple by an orange's standards.
Yeah.
But in the end, just make a fruit smoothie and they're both delicious.
Yeah. Yes. I love that. This podcast is sponsored by the Music Therapy Podcast Collective, also known as MTPC, where you can find a variety of CMTE opportunities in the form of pod courses. All of MTPC's pod courses are built on a listen, learn, apply model, where you start by listening to some assigned podcast episodes, then move into learning with the assistance of a workbook filled with resources for you to start your self-study towards whatever topics are most interesting, inspiring, and applicable to your practice. And then we finish with the apply section, which includes an office hour and a worksheet to determine how you are going to apply your learning to your personal life or professional practice. You can find all the Music Therapy Chronicles pod courses on our website, musictherapychronicles.com, and you can find the entire catalog of pod courses at MTPC's website, mtpodcastcollective.com. Make sure you also get on the MTPC newsletter for 10% off your first pod course purchase. ready for the rapid fire?
I am.
All right. The first one is coffee or tea?
Coffee, and it has to be Pete's coffee and a blend, not a flavor. So don't put hazelnut or vanilla, but I will take a African blend, South American blend. Like, so I get different blends from different regions of the country. So I am a coffee snob. I love my Pete's.
Gotta know what you like.
Yes, I will drink tea, but it's usually when I have a sore throat. So I
Mhm.
associate tea with sickness, so it's not usually my go-to.
Gotcha. Not a relaxing experience for you.
No,
Early bird or night owl?
I'm a neither, but I'm definitely not an early bird. I would prefer like the 11 o'clock bedtime, 7 o'clock wake up time, but that's not
Mhm.
adult work life hours. So I can make myself get up, but it's effortful and I don't stay awake very long these days. So by 10 or
Mhm.
11, it's time to